So now we're going to be using our current terrain to create our large-scale distribution, and using what we already have within the fractal and the materials to figure out what sort of modifications we need to make for our ecosystem. One thing I'm going to do is select our terrain and change it to landscape B. And we're first going to be using our material distribution in order to take a look at how we can break up the ecosystem. Because that would really involve only using or only needing to use the environment tab in order to distribute the ecosystem. Now, I'm not going to have the entire terrain in view for this, just because a smaller area around the center should be more than enough to really tell how much distribution we need. If we're too far away, it's going to be difficult to see some of the smaller features. So we may need to create a couple of different camera positions for this, depending on how large the scene is going to be. If you already know the spot you have picked out, then you can just zone in on that area. But for this, what I want is something that's really flexible, where we can kind of fly through this scene and have a good ecosystem for the entire terrain. So I'm just going to pick out this spot, and the distribution should carry out pretty much the same around the outer bounds of our terrain. So this has a nice variation of features, different points of elevation, areas with water, and that's going to be really important. So in this case, we want something that has the primary features available for the entire terrain within one view. And now what I'm going to do is set a material color for each of our layers so that we can see exactly where each material is showing up, and whether or not we want to use those environment settings to populate our ecosystem. So although this may be somewhat time-consuming depending on how many different materials you have and how much you really want to break it down, it's going to save you a lot of time in the end when it comes down to actually working on the ecosystem, especially since we're going to be using dynamic population, which we'll have no preview for, and we'll be creating some population zones for that to be able to see within our OpenGL while we're working on the ecosystem. So first, let's just break down and change the color of these materials. And what we can do is we have this little highlighter icon next to each layer. If we go ahead and click on that, it's going to change that material to a solid color. If you right mouse click, then you can choose which color you'd like to select. So in this case, we want a pretty good distribution of colors, something that's really going to stand out. Also keeping in mind too that we'll have other layers on top of this with transparency, so we don't want something that's going to wash out our other layers. So let's start with just a blue for our light rock, and our dark rock, I'm going to select a darker blue, start moving into more of a purplish tone. Select our grass main cover, and that's going to be pretty simple. We'll go ahead and make that green. Our grass bleed, we can change that color to more of the yellow, and some of these can reflect the colors that they already are, but this will really make them stand out. And now we're going to have that yellow for the shadow and the shaded areas. We're going to make that a rather bright yellow, moving more towards orange. And then our sand, I'm going to go ahead and change that to just black because I know exactly where that sand is showing up, and it's really not going to be that important or something we're going to be using. So now we have this preview showing up in the main camera preview. Let's go ahead and render this out. And because I do want to see some of the finer details, I'm going to use the final mode instead of the preview mode. And just set our resolution to what we have, 1280 by 692, because I'm working with Academy's standard flat aspect ratio, which is one of the film formats. And we'll just go ahead and click render, and we can take a look at this terrain with all of the materials distributed with very solid colors. Okay, so now we can see the completed render, and it looks like around our rocky areas the colors that were selected are a little too close to each other, so they're just kind of blending together and you really can't see the distribution very well. But for all the grass areas, you can see those three layers really well. Our orange for the more shadowed, lighter yellow areas, and we can see these lighter green areas, which is our bleed, and having that go around the edges of the somewhat darker green. So what I want to do is go ahead and save this out, and I've already saved this as landscape B1 material solid colors. And what I've done is set up in the project content folder, there's an images folder, and within that I have ecosystem distribution layers. And this way what we can do is save all of our layers into here, and then use an image editing program to overlay them and kind of plan things out a little more if we want to, or just have them in one folder where we can easily reference them when we're figuring out exactly where we want the ecosystem to go. So whether or not we want to use any of these layers or the settings from these layers is really up to you. In this case, I do like a couple of the different sections that are coming out. I think it's a pretty good distribution overall that of course can be blended with something else. So maybe not by themselves entirely, but once we mix them with other fractals, we'll be able to get a pretty interesting looking result, and also know ahead of time what our ecosystem is going to look like. So what I want to do right now is just create a better blend for our rock and render out another layer. At this point too, I'm also going to save the camera, and now we have camera 1, which is a duplicate of the main camera, so that way if we move the position we can always go back to it and re-render. And the first render you create with the procedural terrain is going to take a little longer than standard terrain or other elements in the scene. But now that we've created the first render, modifying the material, once we re-render again, all the terrain geometry is already loaded into the memory. And if we take a look at the lower right of the screen, and I have this set to polygon count rather than free resources, and what we can see is we have 5 million polygons. So with our terrain and what we can currently see, that's 5 million polygons, and it's saved and buffered in the memory. So when we render again, all that information has already been processed and the render will go much faster. So if we open up our material, what I want to do is just focus on our dark and light rock. So what I want to do is take the rest of our layers and change their color to basically a white. and just going through our grasses, and also that sand layer. And now I'm going to make our dark rock red, and our light rock, we're going to move to blue. So pretty much opposite ends of the spectrum, and we should be able to get much better separation between the two. And if not, then it's possible that we're just a little too far away from those features, and if we want to populate an ecosystem on the rock, we might need to find an area a little bit closer. But that's something we're going to focus on a little later once we start moving into the smaller distribution ranges. So let's just go ahead and render this out so we can have another layer of just our rock, and we can take a look at how the distribution works for that. And now taking a look at the render, we can see it's just about the same thing. If you take a look a little closer, we can go ahead and zoom in. We can start to see some of those red spots showing up. But for the most part, our distribution is blending so well that they're just kind of overlaying. And that doesn't mean that in the actual render itself, with the full materials, it's looking like this, because there's a much better distribution with the actual render. So you could also render out the regular material to use that as a reference. But for the most part, it's mainly because we're too far away. If we got a little closer, we'd see a little more of that detail, but I'm not too worried about the rock layer because those are the areas I really don't want populated with the ecosystem, at least not entirely. Not like the other areas of the scene. I'm going to go ahead and save this out. Same as before, just with the extension rock. And you could save out the Z depth as well, if you want to use that for any post. So we'll just go ahead and save that in case we want to use that a little bit later, just to have it since we've already rendered. Okay, and now we want to take a look at the fractals that are making up the terrain. And we're going to be using just a black and white material to represent their distribution. So I'm going to take time now to save a new version of the scene, saving as landscape B02, and this is going to be the terrain fractal. So all of our terrain fractals we're going to be rendering out separately to take a look at how they work throughout the scene, to see if we want to use them for the distribution. Because if we can use elements from the terrain itself, we're going to end up with something a lot more realistic. So we just save out our variation, and we're going to rename our terrain to O2. And just having these little steps along the way can be really helpful. Okay, so in this case what we want to do is completely reset the material. So now we have just this basic gray, and what I did was just right mouse click on the material and clicked reset. Go to edit our material, and we want to give this a new name. In case we reset any of our other materials, we don't want them both to be named material. Let's call this landscape and fractals. Okay, so now what we need to do is set up a connection between our fractals inside of our terrain and connect them to the distribution of material color. Now, because I reset our material, we're automatically given a black and white gradient color map, which is exactly what we want. Our highlight color is black, so no highlights are going to be showing up, and I do want to see a little bit of the lighting from the scene, so I'm just going to increase the highlight color. We have as a 172 RGB value or 173 lume, just so we have a little bit of highlight, and that'll give us a little more depth, and we can see some of the separations a little bit better. So now we need to go into our terrain. We're going to select the terrain, right mouse click, go to Edit Object to open up the terrain editor, go to the Procedural tab, right mouse click, Edit Function, and I can close out the Output Observer. That's going to be constantly refreshing, and we don't really need to see any of these outputs within the Output Observer. So what we want to do is create our connection, which is going to be Add Output Node. And what I did was just click to get our highlighted red box, right mouse click, Add Output Node, and we're going to add in a custom dependency. And I'm going to do that again. And I'm going to create 4 different custom dependencies. One for each of our fractals, and then also one for the main altitude output. So this first custom dependency, I'm just going to call terrain noise, and the second will be the value noise, and just giving them the same name as what they're going to be connected to. And this is going to be our amp mix, and then I'll just call this one altitude. And what we're going to do is connect to the altitude output of what we just made them for. So for each of the individual fractals, and now we're going to take the altitude and connect it to our blender, and then we're going to have the same connection as the altitude. So now we can open up our material for our landscape. Go to the color and alpha, right mouse click, edit function. And what we're going to be doing is replacing this constant node in the 0 that's there as a placeholder with our custom dependency. So click to get our red highlighted box. We can right mouse click, go to Add Input Node, and select External Dependency. And now we're given the option with the pull down for our dependency to select what we would like to use. We can go to our landscape, and now we can see the terrain noise, the amp mix, value noise, and the altitude, all the custom dependencies we just made, directly available within our material. So we're going to start out with our terrain noise, which is the first of our fractals, and we can connect the distribution from black to white with our color map using this external dependency. And if we take a look, we can see just in this small preview that we have a lot of oversampling. This can be difficult to kind of decipher exactly where all the in-between areas are. So what we can do is modify the connection, basically by using our filter that we already have in between the dependency and our color map, and just modifying the output. And in this case, what we can use is the offset x plus a, and we can turn that down and then click to refresh. And it looks like for the most part we do need to raise it up so that we can see the full distribution. And now we have a lot more detail. Of course, we can use a threshold if we want to cut this off, but it's good to see as much of the gradient as possible so we know where we can clip it if we need to. So I'm going to set this to 0.6 and just take a look. And it looks like we'll need to go a little bit higher. Okay, so now we have it at 0.7. We'll bring it up to 7.5 just to go a little bit higher. And now I'm going to render this out. And we can go ahead and save another layer and see if we want to use this as part of the distribution. And now we can see the first fractal rendered out. And keep in mind too that this can be inverted. Right now, in its current state, basically our ecosystem would show up in the white areas, and then all the dark and black areas there would be no population. But this can be easily inverted with the opposite node. So if we need to use that a little bit later, I can show you how we can just add that in as a filter. So what I'm going to do now is just save this out, and we're going to still with the B group, but now landscape number 2, and we're just going to call these the fractals. And then I'm going to give them the names so that we remember which one is which. And this is the terrain noise. And I'm going to go through and just do what we did before, changing that external dependency and render out each one of these layers. So just go ahead and close that out. Open the material, edit the function. And I can change this to the, let's do the second one, which is the value of noise, even though it doesn't show up in the right order. That is the second one that we have. And in this case, our offset isn't going to work, so we might need to modify that and make changes. So basically, I'll just be making some tweaks and rendering these out so we can take a look at the distribution and see if we would like that to become part of our ecosystem population. So I'm just going to jump ahead and render these out, and then we'll pick up from there with all of our layers completed.